Det er mærkeligt, at jeg...
Men maskerligt?
Nå, det går nok.
Det er virkelig syv for mit hjem, ja.
Godt. Inden den er...
Hi and welcome back to the channel. What I talked about last time was that this time I was going to talk about some history, and we were also going to talk about racism, and that's why I have Tess here, who is a... Please present yourself.
I'm a researcher. I work with gender, race, class, different forms of representation and ways of sort of encompassing those differences in real life.
Yes, so today it's going to be more historical, it's going to be more scientific, and we're going to talk about gender.
One of the reasons I wanted to come and talk and be on your channel, and thank you for inviting me and hosting me, is because I think very rarely we think about these issues about hair as something that is both tied to gender and to race. So when we talk about body hair, it's almost very often, at least in a Scandinavian or European context, framed as something that has to do with gender. And of course it has a lot to do with gender, but it also has a lot to do with race. And I think it's really interesting that you're trying to bring up this conversation in a way that can talk about both. Yeah, so that's kind of the frame for why I think it's an important conversation to have. Throughout this conversation, I'm probably going to say race a lot, and it's important to note or like mention that race, of course, isn't a real biological category. Biological race differences between humans have pretty much been disproven by DNA research. So the reason I use the term race is more to signify the ways that socially we still understand people through these racial categories, even though more and more science is disproving how we thought race worked. So socially these categories still shape who has access to proper healthcare, good jobs, how people get discriminated against in terms of wages and general sort of equal rights in societies across the world. So when I talk about race, that's what I'm talking about, the social construction or category of race. And with that category comes a lot of normalized societal expectations of what is beautiful, or what we call beauty standards usually, and these things tie in with body hair. Yeah.
So when people say that they're like colorblind, for instance, it's actually like it comes from a good place, but it's actually it's really harmful, because that means that you can't, if you can't put a label on something, if you can't talk about something, then you also can't talk about the problems. And that's the thing with like the word race. You have to have a word for the discrimination that's going on.
Precisely, yeah. So these days, most of us probably wouldn't identify with the category racist. That's not something that we feel comfortable being called. And a lot of people don't even feel comfortable using the category race, right? Because it has pretty much been disavowed. But when we say, oh, I don't believe in color, or I don't see color, I'm colorblind, really what we're saying is I also don't really recognize or acknowledge the difference in treatment that people are still encountering because of these social categories of race. So it has all of the best intentions, but it can actually be pretty harmful. And that's a sociologist, Eduardo Bonilla Silva, who wrote about that.
Yeah. Okay. So if we go back historically, I have tried to research this hair thing that's going on, and these hair standards and hair norms for women and men. I read a lot about that, like hair removal is or was quite normal. But then I also notice that a lot of these articles, they're also ads for hair removal products. Yeah, which I also think like it really does have an impact on us when we read about something and then actually it's a commercial, but we don't know that it's a commercial. And also it's always kind of like implicit, that hair removal is normal, that it is accepted. And it might have been, I don't know like how much you looked into it, like it might have been a thing on and off. Like in history, sometimes people have removed hair, sometimes they haven't. But what I found is that it's only in the recent years, the recent couple of 100 years, that there has been like this very intense distinction on like which gender should remove hair and which gender doesn't have to.
Yeah.
And I think that's like mainly the last 100 years it has been, it's like really been a thing. And before that, like a couple of 100 years back. And it looks like it starts with colonialism.
Yeah.
And also like a funny thing that I read, it's because like when I talk to people, a lot of people say hair removal is normal, it's on and off right now, like you have to do it, you should just do what society says. But yeah, there has been like different standards and different, how can you say, like historical, different fads or different traditions. And at one point in time, it was popular to shave off your eyebrows, find a mouse, skin the mouse.
Oh wow.
Yeah, take the mouse hair and like put it on to like have thicker eyebrows from like mouse hair. So that's one trend that used to.
Heard about that. That sounds. That sounds not safe. Don't do that, kids.
and also at one point in time, it was also like popular. I think I'm not sure it was Queen Elizabeth, but it was some queen, where it was popular to have as little hair as possible on your face. So people would like shave their eyebrows, and they would also shave like the hairline to have big foreheads, because like big foreheads was like really popular. But I also think there's like there's a reason why people tend to do something, why something is popular. For instance, when the royals do something, it becomes popular, and the royals have power, and in order to like imitate the royals or imitate the power or be closer to someone visually who has power, and that way like get some recognition or get some power yourself, you want to look like this ruling class, which then could be the royals.
I think that's definitely one part of the truth. Is sort of this, there's an aspirational aspect to beauty standards, right? That we try and look like whatever we signify as sort of better or more achieved or higher class or whatever. But I think there's also a real trend of appropriation within those upper bars of society. So if you look at this from sort of a anti-capitalist or class critical perspective, what we see is very often these beauty standards are trends that are also picked up or played on years later from being stolen from people who are marginalized or oppressed in different ways. We see this with fashion trends as well, sort of stuff that is associated. We're wearing matching sweatsuits today. Stuff that's associated with, or was associated with, working class outfits before being repurposed and retrendified or made popular again.
And now it's like more like a blogger outfit.
Yes.
I think it's called athleisure.
Yeah.
And it did come in the 90s. I think it started really in the 90s.
Yeah, I definitely think that there's sort of there's layers of this where it's not necessarily always that trend starts at the top of the social hierarchy of the society, but it's that's where it sort of gets spread, or that's where so it's what we actually see is sort of a migration where a lot of it is stolen from the bottom of society, and then it gets repurposed at the top, and then it sort of disseminates through.
Yeah, so you can like take it from the bottom of society, and then you repurpose it, then you put a price tag on it, and then you sell it back down.
Yeah, and then we see that the people who actually profit off of these trends are usually the people who are already sort of the ruling classes of society, which is really interesting because they are benefiting off of ideas that usually aren't their own. I think what you were saying before about the sort of the ways that these beauty standards for hair have changed over time, even within our lifetime, and we're relatively young, I think I've seen how body grooming and hair grooming has changed just from the 90s to the early 2000s to now. I think there's definitely sort of been these different shifts about whether we should be hairless or not on our body, and to what degree and where. And I was listening to a really interesting podcast with Alok a located on a gender non-conforming performance artist and poet today. And one of the things they said was, when we talk about these trends changing, it's important to notice which parts of the body are they changing for. Suddenly it becomes very radical to have hair on your legs or hair in your armpit, but we don't really talk about the places where hair is assumed to not be appropriate in general, like facial hair. And these are sort of the things that aren't negotiated as much. So we talk about hair trends changing, but there are sort of some parts of body hair that are sort of always made taboo or considered inappropriate or different or othering. And very often these specific forms of difference with hair relate to racialization. So very often it's more radical or seen as more radical or more different or more wrong when we have dark skin and dark hair. The hair gets associated immediately with something dirtier or more animalistic or more other, wild, than it would if it were see-through hair or white hair, right? So I think that sort of is one of the places where race enters the conversation, or racialization enters the conversation about hair.
And I also noticed that like there's often like some associated racialization, if you can call it that, with like several body parts, like big noses. White people tend to have smaller noses often, and when people have big noses, it is seen as ugly, and like nose operations. What racialisation?
Rhinoplasty.
Rhinoplasty, like the numbers are really surging. If you can say that, can you say that?
Yeah.
You can say that. And often these the things that we associate with like not that pretty or not okay or should rather be changed or should be fixed are things that you can find outside of the white race, the things that you can find outside of white people. So, and one of them is like big noses, dark hair, more hair. A lot of these things are often in society are often seen as not pretty or just like not acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think it has something to do with like the way it's associated with like people of color having these
character traits or racial markers, even.
Yeah, having these character traits or racial markers.
Yeah, I think that that's a big part of the conversation, and I think what we often don't really consider with our beauty standards is that they are very frequently informed by what we would call in media research white gaze or a male gaze. So basically perspectives on beauty or ideas about beauty that are sort of shaped by society's more general acceptance of patriarchy and acceptance of white supremacy. So there, these ideas about beauty are informed by years and years and years of colonialism and global inequality that have produced beauty standards that shape the whole world from a white perspective. Even when I go to India every once in a while, I'm still finding whiteness creams and other sort of beauty markers, and even in the choice of models for magazines, we see colorism. We see that there's a hierarchy of beauty that is still very much shaped by an idea about whiteness, small noses, less hair. These are the things that sort of still inform beauty standards, even in places where the majority of the population isn't white. And I think that that's an important part of the conversation to have, because very often if you bring this up in a country where the majority of the population is white, the answer is, well, of course that's a beauty standard here. Most of us look like that, so why wouldn't that be the beauty standard here? And I think it's important to sort of dig a little bit deeper and interrogate why, first of all, why that's necessarily the beauty standard just because there's a majority of folks that look like that, but also what histories and on a global scale, what power dynamics inform those beauty standards, how have they spread, and what kind of harm can they do? telling me about how very often when you get interviewed about this, the part that gets cut out is sort of the part that has most to do with race and colonialism. Do you want to explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, I always in interviews I try to also focus on race and colonialism and how it is harder for women of color to achieve this femininity that's kind of held up here, because well, some women, in order to reach this hairlessness, they have to do more than others, and often it's women from countries where you do have darker hair and just more visible hair. So for these women, we'd have to like literally shave all the time, because like when hairs are dark, they're just like more visible than when they're light. And it also becomes this like idea of you're not a real woman, so you're not a real person, so we can mock you and treat you worse. And that's like, I think that just shows up that like humanity and femininity are in some ways intertwined. They're inseparable. So if you want to be treated like a human, you have to be a woman in the modern sense, and you become this woman in the modern sense by also removing hair. And just like, let's face it, like we talked about, like for women from India, it's like it's a lot harder than for a woman who's like very light hair and is from, I don't know, maybe Sweden, or I don't know, you can't really put a country on it, you know, but you know what I mean. Like for white women with very light hair, and I'm not saying this to like attack anyone, and I just want to say like it's kind of an issue for all women, but it becomes more also of a race issue for women from different parts of the world. So you can't achieve this femininity and you can't achieve this humanity if you don't fit into these like hair standards.
Right.
And it's body hair, but it can also be like head hair. And we have like, for women, we have so many rules about hair for what's like proper hair. And it is extremely time consuming for women to always have to change these things in order to just like be able to go out into public.
Yeah, you're making me think about femonationalism or feminationalism, and this basic idea that when you are an othered woman or a racially othered woman, or when you're racialized as a minority.
Can we just maybe say like othered or racialized? What does that mean?
So othered basically means when you are made to be the other, in terms of sort of the standard or the norm or the regular person.
Yeah.
For instance, in where we live, this person would usually be white, right? So we become the other of that.
So that will kind of be the subject or the main character in the story, and then all the other people would then be people of color.
People who are othered in different ways. So there's
exactly.
grounds for discrimination like race, age, ability, class, and so on. And you can be othered with all of those categories. But in terms of sort of the racial other, I think what's so interesting here is basically whatever you do that is a feminist act if you were white will not necessarily be read as a feminist act when you're not. So what gets understood or read in public as feminist and groundbreaking, like letting your hair grow all over your face, right, would be seen as sort of a manifesto feminist thing if you were white. But because you're not white, you get read a little bit differently, as though it might just be that you're a little less civilized. And this ties into these, like,
and it's also like what's often tied to race in like a white country context is like the dirtiness. So it's like, oh, you're not a feminist. No, because you're not white, then you're dirty.
So in our shared imaginary of the normal person, who's usually considered white, and the other person, who's usually not, we have these ideas that tie to that, including words like feminism. And so even though two people might be doing the exact same thing, it might only get interpreted as feminist if you fit the idea of what we think feminism looks like. And very often people will think feminism looks white because that's what we see in film and media. That's the story we've been sold about what feminism is in these contexts. So in that way, race plays a role even in terms of just how what you do with your own body is interpreted, whether you are interpreted as doing it out of your own choice. And the same happens when we think about scarves, headscarves in Denmark. Very often here, if you wear one, it is framed as though it's not your choice. Because it's hard to even fathom for the shared imaginary that you could be a woman who is in your own feminist right making choices about your body, right? So that's the way that race plays into how our choices as women get interpreted.
And it's also as if like a brown woman, a woman of color, can't make her own choices for her body. It either has to be like, oh, it's because she's uncivilized, or oh, because someone forces her. But maybe like that woman isn't the problem. The problem are the onlookers, the norm, who can see this person as her own subject, as a person who's making her own choices. And about the headscarf discussion, some of my friends who are white, they sometimes wear headscarf just for fashion, because they like the scarf, or because it's cold, and no one ever comments or says anything because, oh, that's like her choice for her fashion sense or body or whatever. But like if it's a woman of color, a Muslim woman, it always gets looked upon definitely in a different way.
I think what sticks with me with what you're saying too is this kind of individualist level, right? So very often when we stick out and when we break with the norms would be sort of the general expectations of what is normal or normal behavior and what makes us fit in with what is normal. When we break that, for instance, by growing our hair in places that we are assumed to not have hair, what happens is kind of the story around it gets made individual. So it becomes something that is very much about your choice, your body, your freedom, and you as a person.
That's actually what has annoyed me a lot about some of the... I mean, it's good that the articles are out there, and I really applaud all women, and I think that like also actually the white women who are doing the work with like growing their body hair and trying to change opinions on that, I totally applaud it. I think it's good because like you have to take the fights that other people can't or won't, or they're going to be looked down upon worse if they do it. So it's good that the people are doing it, but like the way it has been individualized, it's often about like some of the messages I get are people text me, oh, it's good that you are who you want to be, and it's like I'm not like wanting to be anyone or anything. I just literally I wake up and I walk out of the door, and I don't understand why it's like, oh, just do you, and it's not about you do you. It's like years of oppression against women.
Yeah, and I think that's so interesting. I find that a lot in my own research as well, that there's a real tendency when we're trying to talk about oppression or inequality, sexism, racism, that there's a real wish to make it an individual story, to talk about this on an individual or interpersonal level. So if we talk about discrimination, we tend to want to talk about one person discriminating another person. And the same happens when we're talking about racism or sexism. We want to talk about it as an individual thing. And I think that has to do with it's easier to fix it if we just have to fix a few people's behavior, and if we can consider this something that has just got to do with a few bad apples. But if we're actually looking at this as on a systemic or structural level and actually thinking, instead of talking to you about your choices, what we should be talking to is everybody about why society requires women to look in a certain way and not have hairs in certain places, then that shift to make it a structural conversation, I think that is intimidating, because it means we all have to do a lot of work in terms of unlearning sexist and racist and colonialist ideas of beauty.
So it's not about like, I read once, it's not about like how your daughter acts, it's how you raise your son. And this is about like how everybody raises their sons. Because the people that object to my face, my looks, are most often men. Like 99% of the time, they are men. And these men, they have to in some way learn to respect women and not tell us like what to do or what not to do.
Right.
So it's not about a few bad apples saying bad comments. It's not about that. It's about like why and how all of society is doing this against all women, and why they should stop doing this. Also for their own sake, because sometimes when I get messages from men, which I do, where they're telling me that I should remove my hair, I feel like that they think that I'm robbing them of their masculinity, that I'm robbing them of their manlyhood by just existing. And I'm not. What do you think about that?
I think there's definitely something to be said here about when we break down these norms for what gender is supposed to look like, what a correct woman is supposed to look like, we often forget that breaking down those norms will benefit everybody in society. It will benefit men as well. It will benefit everybody who has been made to fit into these really conform, narrow ideas about what beauty and gender is. And I think the resistance might come from folks who benefit the most from those systems and structures right now. But
because they do benefit, like the time, I don't know how many hours like in a lifetime a woman spends removing hair, but I know I read somewhere, this is probably not a good source, but like I read that women spend like up to a year. No, that's not realistic, is it?
I hope not.
that was just for makeup. No, that can be true. But I think it's quite a lot of time that women spend like worrying about how do men look at me, and it's not about being attractive at all. It's just like about being acceptable. It's just about being left alone when you are outside, when you walk on the street. You know, we worry a lot about like, shit, am I gonna be left alone today? I know I do every day. Yeah, so we would win so much time, and we would win so much like mental energy, I think. If
and
we
I
didn't constantly have to like censor ourselves.
And I think all of society would benefit from this ultimately, because what happens is men are also made to fit with gendered norms for what a man looks like, what colors they're supposed to wear, how their facial hair is supposed to grow, how their hair is supposed to look, whether it's attractive or not, if they're balding. All of these different norms shape all of us in ways that are really harmful and ways that affect our health and our understanding of ourselves and how we get treated in society. And I think we also all participate in policing and disciplining each other into fitting these roles. Mm-hmm. So I think that's something. I'm not trying to say that everybody is a part of this and we can all solve this, because of course hierarchies and power structures impact who has the most chance to make a big impact and change here. But I do think that these are structures and systems that we've been raised with and socialized into, and we police each other. We talk to other folks of our own gender to get them to fit as well. And I think that there's something to be said for all of us kind of liberating ourselves a little bit from the very idea that we have to do gender in a certain way.
Definitely. And about the disciplining and policing, I think it's interesting because now it's mostly on social media, but I do get messages from men like disciplining me. And I think that's because, I don't know if it's like, if it's conscious or unconscious, but the way they think that they hold power over me, the way they are higher in the hierarchy, and the way they're higher, I think like they feel attacked by me, that I'm trying to get up here and be like, I don't care what you think.
And I think what really sticks out to me when you get these messages, and I mean we've been talking about these messages for a long time, and I think what struck me is we are very likely as viewers, as people who are talking about this, those of you who are watching the channel, to immediately jump to wanting to problematize those men. And to want to say harassment is the problem, being aggressive is the problem. But I think what we need to think about is, in order for those men to act in that way, there has to be a baseline in society of sexism, that allows people to look at you strange when you walk down the street, or to just check you an extra time, or that allows for regular policing of gender through much smaller means and just through language that we don't notice as much, but that builds the grounds or the foundation for these men to think that that's appropriate, right? So I always say that sexual harassment and sort of more direct forms of sexual violence and sexual harassment or sexist harassment is directly tied to these much more foundational structures and understandings of difference that we don't think as critically about. And if we did that, it would perhaps stop people before they got to a point where they felt it was appropriate to contact you like that.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm also thinking, why do they even get that idea? It must be very ingrained in our society that women have to remove hairs for people to even think about it. It's not because they're messaging me something random. It's a very specific thing, you know. It's not that they're messaging me, hey, did you remember to eat your vitamins today? It's not, you know, like, it's not some sort of concern or some sort of like random weird message. It's always about this one exact same thing. And I hear it from other people who in some way stick out of the norm by weight, for instance. They also get these messages with people trying to police them. And as you said, it's not a few bad apples, and I don't care about the comments or the messages. I'm not like, I couldn't care less. But what's annoying, you know, it's like the structural problem we have in society that even like gives this like a conscious the sexism.
Yeah, I think that's sort of, I think we see that a lot, where this is a general pattern that happens with people who break norms. And what's so interesting to me about it is, I mean, I hate to do a film reference, but I'm a film scholar, so I can't help it. It's almost like you've broken a little bit out of the matrix and everybody can see that you're sticking out, but what you're sticking out is actually doing is it's revealing the whole system of oppression that everybody is oppressed under. So these very little acts of breaking with norms, maybe they trouble us so much because they're really a mirror to all of the ways that we conform. So maybe they're a mirror to all of the ways that these men have worked so hard and tried so hard to attain masculinity and to live up to masculinity and to retain gender norms, and they've been groomed into a system, right?
Groomed.
And I think that that's part of what's so provocative then, when it's not, I don't think that it's really about you. It manifests towards you, which is very real and needs to be taken seriously. But I think to a high degree, this is about you holding up a mirror to all of the ways that these people constantly conform.
I hope I do.
I hope you do.
I've been thinking about, so some people, they write me, but hair removal is normal, people have been doing it for centuries, why is it a problem now? What would you say to that?
Well, I mean, I think, first of all, just because we've been doing something for centuries doesn't necessarily mean that it's the right thing or
like
a great thing to do for everyone.
Witches and
yeah, so I mean,
not good for anyone.
to sort of start the conversation off, things that we've been doing for 200 years aren't necessarily right because we've been doing them for 200 years, and they don't necessarily benefit everybody. But that being said, of course, I mean, hair removal isn't just a thing that only occurs in these Scandinavian countries that we live in, or it isn't something that is specifically always linked to whiteness if we look through history. It occurs in other cultures and other times throughout history and in different ways. Hair removal has been used in all kinds of ways to sort of shape beauty ideals, like you explained before, with making the forehead higher, but it can be the way that we've treated our eyebrows, the way that we've treated all kinds of hair on our body. And
also somewhere during some periods people used to draw on like unibrows. That has been popular as well and seen as a sign of beauty. So it kind of fluctuates what's like beauty, what's not, what's popular, what's not popular. But the problem now is these very like harsh rules that you have to follow, where it's not about a trend or a fashion.
Yeah, it's basically, the idea here isn't that we're trying to say that this is per se evil. People should be free to remove their hair or not remove their hair as they'd like, and that's just kind of the baseline for how we would like everybody to be treated. So it basically doesn't, what we're trying to say is not that this is necessarily a pattern that only ties to one specific history. It ties to all kinds of histories. But we could definitely see and assume that one of the reasons that it's become super important and super popularized now has to do with whiteness and colonialism and contemporary beauty standards. So when we pluck our hairs or remove our hairs in certain ways, we're not usually doing it, in at least in these contexts, because it was a trend in a certain culture in another place
Because
300
that
years
was
ago.
better back then.
But it's usually tied to the last 200 years of European style, and that's usually sort of what sets these bars and these beauty standards today, and that's kind of why it's important to think about the history of them and to try and interrogate, well, when we're doing it, what does it mean? What kind of norms are we upholding? What are we kind of reproducing? And even though it can have other histories and other stories, and for those people who feel like that is an important part of why they do it, we're not saying that you shouldn't do hair removal.
But
We're basically just saying that, think about or interrogate why it is so important and which kind of norms you're trying to sort of fit in with when you do it.
Yeah. So it's about beauty in a colonial context that we can like unsubscribe from, because we live in this world that we live in.
Yeah, of course there are other contexts, but I think what's important here to think about is which context is informing our choices right now. And while there are plenty of other contexts that are relevant and interesting for us to look at, chances are the reason that you're being policed so heavily has more to do with contemporary standards of beauty than whether somebody was, hair removing in another context, another time, in another way.
In Egypt.
Yeah, so even though there are probably other people who subscribe to similar beauty standards as the ones that we're being critical of today or talking about today, and that's completely fair, what we're trying to say is basically these beauty standards that we are experiencing are very linked to very specific forms of oppression that we have a problem with. I think what we're also getting at here is our society right now has a lot of information, and we have a lot of access to information about beauty. I mean, there's been access available about beauty or information available about beauty for a while now. You would get it maybe through art or museums back in the day. Now we get it on Instagram every 5 minutes, right?
It's all of the time. It's never, like you can go on Instagram every 5 minutes and you do that.
Yeah, we are fed a lot of stories about what is beautiful, and it removes beauty ideals a little bit from us, because we're not just looking up to the women in our families, we're not just looking up to the folks around us or in our local community. We're able to sort of normalize and spread out ideals of beauty in much wider contexts, and that can
much
be
wider or much wider?
Wider, much broader contexts. And I think what that does is we can change these things pretty quickly. If people that we really look up to, who are huge celebrities or who are groundbreaking in other ways or have a lot of followers, you can have a pretty quick impact by changing how much you abide to certain norms.
But don't you think that they would then fall out of that the placement, the place they have in society, high up in the hierarchy? Because what I think about is media, we say it's social media and it's democratic and everybody controls it, but in a way it's not. I also think who gets to be visible.
Yeah,
that's also heavily policed, I remember that was before social media really had a big breakthrough, but when Britney Spears shaved her hair, she was seen as a fallen woman.
Yeah.
But if a man shaved his hair, like, he wouldn't have been seen as a fallen man. He would have been seen as some guy who got a haircut. Like, who would even notice, you know?
Yeah.
So it's also like how media and society and also like the algorithms, do they bump people up or do they bump them down? If you can even say that, if they don't adhere to these rules, you know?
Yeah, I think that there's definitely something to be said about consumption as well, right? We want to consume stuff that confirms our beauty ideals. So, and when Britney shaved her head, that was immediately consumed as a story of a fallen woman, which I think is, as you said, it points out that breaking from norms, even in the very least bit, risks a lot more for us if we are minoritized in any way, even in terms of gender, even just in terms of binary gender. So even just as a woman, you are more vulnerable to being, to having your choices of head style, hairstyle completely like scrutinized by everyone.
It's crazy, like how much hair on women, like how it can mean so much, and how it's seen upon as like, if you're fallen or not fallen, if you're successful, if you're well groomed, like if you have your life together, it can be like your haircut or your eyebrows that define that for a woman.
Yeah, and I think what happens too is, if you are in a position of power, I mean, because Britney was also able to sort of build her way back in, if you're in a position of power, you also have a unique chance to reshape those narratives. And I'm not sure that with Britney's bald head that we necessarily see that happening, but I think about celebrities like Harry Styles wearing a dress. And of course, there's so much to be said about who gets celebrated for doing that when gender non-conforming folks have been doing it forever. But I think it is interesting to see if you were in a privileged enough position that you might be able to get away with breaking norms a little bit and actually get celebrated for it, although you will also encounter a lot of hate, and that kind of, it does allow us to shine a little bit of light, I think, on how strong norms are, but also who gets the privilege to break norms. And I think the more layers of oppression that you experience, the more is at risk when you break these norms. And I have
been thinking about that with myself, you know, because like, do I have a privilege so I can break norms, or am I just like completely stupid and have like disregard for my own success and safety? We'll figure it out. So in the colonialist history, there has been a hyper-masculinization of both men and women of color. And when we talk about the women, it's often tied to hair. It is also tied to noses. It can be tied to size. It can be tied to women being called aggressive or pushy. Can you tell us something about that, like in a historical context, or is it still something we see today?
The root of this ties to the very sort of foundational binary idea that was used for the foundation and grounds for colonialism.
And what's a binary idea?
So the idea that a binary idea basically is built on the idea that there's just a binary idea is basically just that there are two things in opposition to each other and that we can divide any given thing into two. So when we say binary about gender, it refers to the idea that there are just men and women. When we say binary in terms of thinking of race, it usually refers to the idea that we think of race in terms of white and black. And what happens very often when we're thinking in binaries is we lose a lot of nuance. We lose a lot of detail, and we lose a lot of folks who don't fit into one of these categories that are usually two in these binaries.
Or you push people into a category just to be able to exist.
Right. So fitting into a binary becomes the only way that you can be understood. And so we see these binary categories across pretty much anything that you could be discriminated against, right? That very often that they're understood as either you are X category or you're not. Either you're discriminated against or you're not. And The very premise of early race research and the very premise of early understandings of difference that coexisted with and became part of the legitimization of colonialism was built around those types of binaries. For instance, civilized versus uncivilized, or having culture versus nature. And so when we think about the marginalized or colonialized context, they're very often framed as closer to nature, more natural, less civilized than the opposite binary. So
and that's like the comments that I often get, that I'm like natural, which is like, it can be like a nice thing, but it's like, you're not cultured, you're natured. But I do, and now the words disappear again, but a lot of those words that you just used, the messages insulting me use those words, that I'm not civilized, that I'm not cultured.
that's really interesting, because I think part of what that ties into is also that these forms of oppression, racism, sexism, various forms of discrimination can occur within positively intended frameworks. This is what we call benevolence in research. So it can happen when people say, folks like you dance really well, or folks like you are so close to nature. These types of well-intended or even framed like compliments.
It's the naive savage. I think that's like the word for it.
Exactly. So they basically tie in with this idea that as long as we are celebrating the other, we can't understand that it can still be violent to be defining them as inherently other. And we don't understand that by saying something like, you kinds of people are so good at dancing, right? There's going to be a linkage that says, on the other hand, here we are, and we're not good at dancing, but with that story comes this idea that we are very cultured and we are very good at writing and thinking and intellectualizing.
So it's this link between like the brain and the body, and in this binary, like you said, it gets like dissected or like disassociated. So either like you're good at dancing and you're very bodily and you're connected to the nature, to the body, or you're natural, you are happy because you are simple. And here I am, the European intellectual,
complex and
struggling about the meaning of life, and I cannot dance.
And that's exactly that's the problem, right? Is that we often think that these binaries aren't harmful if we're and that we often think that racism is just looking at another person and seeing them as less valuable than you. We don't understand that it can be harmful and damaging even if you, in your own mind, don't look down on folks. But the mere fact that you're defining them as different from you in ways that have historically been used to marginalize and colonialize these folks, meanwhile privileging you, that's what's harmful here. So even though you say something that you think is well-intended or kind, it might actually be really damaging.
Because it's still, like you said before, it can still be othering, and when you other people and when you put them in like the other side of your binary, then you also simplify them. You see them as like, you are good at this, but you cannot be this.
Right. That's it, basically called essentialism or essentializing in research. So the idea that when you define, the very act of defining narrows people down, essentializes them into something, and thereby that in itself is a little bit violent. And I think that that's kind of the root cause or the history that ties in with this understanding of the aggressive other, the violent other, the in their body other, and that hits both men and women. And I think that it ties very much into the same way that racially othered folks are also considered in their body or considered more masculine, strong, bodily, also through things like hair.
And also more sexual, actually.
Yes.
I think there's a whole lot of list when you say natural. It doesn't only mean like natural, like you're not running in a field smelling all the flowers, rolling around and frolicking in the grass in the sunshine. it does mean like it has like a whole lot of like negative adjectives where it ends up being, well, as we talked about before, dirty, less intelligent, more prone to reacting aggressively and quickly.
Those might be like the underlying ideas, but I think what's important to state here is that you can, as a person, not believe any of those things and still perpetuate the racisms that are built on those ideas. So you can actually still, you can still not abide by or not believe that folks are dirty or under-civilized or any of those things, and you can still participate in the same forms of oppression that are tied to those histories by wanting to consume the other, or wanting to have more of the other, or hypersexualizing the other, making them more exotic or interesting, or something that you want. There's a theorist called Bell Hooks who writes about this and explains how even the hypersexualization or the wanting to consume the other, which is so clearly often well-intended, or something that people think of as well-intended. They think of themselves as, I can't be racist because I want to have sex with you. What really happens is, within that desire lies some of the same ideas of otherness. Part of what makes you attractive as an othered person is exactly that, they want to try something different, right?
And then they see themselves like as the norm, the subjective, and you as the other, as, you know, a little field trip or as some kind of token.
Right.
Well, thanks for tuning in and watching this video. I'll make some more about hair, because that's apparently a bigger topic than I thought. I look forward to being boring and not uttered. And yeah, please like, comment, subscribe, and a thank you to Tess.
Thanks for having me.
And what are your Instagram handles? Where can people find you? We're trying to be very young here.
People can find me on Instagram, Tess Skadegård Thorsen, I think, and my website, tessskadegårdthorsen.com, and on Twitter, Tess Thorsen, Tess_Thorsen. Yeah. So funny.
And do you have a TikTok that people?
I don't have a TikTok. I'm gonna be one of those awkward millennials if I go on TikTok. I'll be one of those people who doesn't really fit in there. So
honestly, I already feel like an awkward millennial on Instagram. I'm like,
me too.
Even right now.
And I'm new to Instagram, and I'm still learning it, and I don't fit on a lot of social media. For a media researcher, it's embarrassing, but I don't fit anywhere.
It kind of is. Actually, I tried making like a Twitter, but I can't, and like I spent hours, and like at some point I just gave up. So, okay, well, thanks for today.
Thank you.